Chapter 14. A Walk in the Forest. Queen Zetalia made her way at a leisurely pace, along the very same track that she had walked 1,000 times before. It came as a mild surprise to realize that she might actually miss this place, if by some miracle the unthinkable happened, and Zimodian 110's discovery resulted in the confirmation of a Grade 1 habitable planet. As absurdly improbable as such an outcome might be, it had still left her in a contemplatively melancholy mood, and the thought of actually leaving Zycadia provoked hidden emotional ties she had not previously even known were there. However, as the Queen so often reminded herself during these moments of quiet introspection, great leaders made great sacrifices when they were called upon to do so. When the day finally came, she would more than willingly let go of all her old attachments, and that included, of course, her leisurely stroll through the forest. It may have seemed like such a small, perhaps even trivial thing, but she, of course, knew better. When you got to be this old, it was the little things that mattered the most. Unfortunately for her, though, this was not something even her own Shihari children could hope to understand, so she would instead choose to stoically suffer in silence, rather than run the risk of being unjustly labeled nothing but an overprivileged elite who couldn't possibly know anything about what real sacrifice truly meant. Zetalia let out a disconsolate sigh before forcibly turning her train of thought back to more pressing matters. Although the deep orbital scan had firmed up the probabilities somewhat, it was still largely inconclusive, which meant that they could not yet completely rule out the possibility that Quaverly, the small rocky planet orbiting around a stellar, was actually habitable, with a probability range of 0.01% at Grade 1 right through to 14.2% at Grade 5. These numbers were dramatically less impressive than those originally reported to her by the General, but they were still far from insignificant, and more than enough to justify his 400-year scouting mission. As it turned out, though, lack of certitude was its own kind of good news, as doubt left room for hope, and hope was a powerful force which had fueled her nest for many centuries, even as the planet continued to slowly die all around them. So far, at least, everything had continued to fall into place quite nicely. General Zimodian already had preliminary planning for the mission well underway, and his overwhelming enthusiasm for the project continued to factor perfectly into her own overarching objectives. The fact that they both saw this eyeball planet in a very different light really didn't matter at all, just so long as he continued to do what she needed him to do. This particular line of thought served to improve her frame of mind quite considerably, and she suddenly felt newly inspired to pick up the pace in order to more seriously challenge her fitness. The new prototype Z-Bot followed along a few meters back behind the Queen. Zethusela had dubbed the unit Ji-Wu, claiming it had steadfastly refused to choose a name for itself, which struck her as mildly bemusing. This Z-Bot, after all, possessed more intellectual processing power than the whole of Zycadia combined, or so she had been led to believe anyway. And yet it couldn't come up with something as simple as its own name? Of course there was a world of difference between not being able to do something and refusing to do it. Perhaps it really was just plain stubborn or contrarian, or maybe it wanted Zethusela to name it for some intricately contrived and esoteric reason. Well, if that was so, its true level of sophistication just might extend far beyond the simple brute force capacity of its raw computational capabilities, which was a possibility that both excited and disturbed her in equal amounts. Regardless, one thing was certain. It was now finally starting to prove itself worthy of the enormous investment she had sunk into its creation. With the thing now finally complete, she had wasted no time setting it to work by getting it to perform a preliminary analysis of their existing antimatter engine design, which had apparently led to some very promising, if still purely theoretical, optimizations. Assuming testing was able to verify the proposed improvements, then they could be exploited by trading these enhancements to Zimi for additional time credits. And of all the decreasing resources on Zycadia, It was surely time that was fast becoming the most valuable commodity of all. This new G-bot gave her a decisive edge in the war against the doomsday clock, and one that she was eager to exploit to its maximum potential. Yet again, and in spite of the growing mob of naysayers, it seemed she had proved the old adage to still be true. You had to spend time in order to make time. There was, however, still the thorny issue of Zethusela to deal with. As far as she was able to determine, he had stayed true to his word, and for the most part so had she. But he was an inherently untrustworthy actor in a complex web of deceit, and as such needed to be removed from the playing field sooner rather than later. The bottom line was, Zethusela was the proverbial loose end, and if there was one thing Zetalia genuinely detested, it was loose ends. But before she could properly tie this particular one up, she needed Series 5 to go beyond the prototype phase, so they could at long last start scaling up towards full production. Very annoyingly, the brains driving this latest Gen She-bot were allegedly both exceedingly slow to manufacture and resource. No, producing these things at scale was going to be a serious problem, especially without violating the painfully restrictive environmental laws. But she had every confidence Cecilia and her team of designers and engineers would figure out a way around them. Sometimes you just had to have faith. The much bigger problem, however, was there was apparently some sort of mysterious design element related to this latest Z-bot. Zethusela had very frustratingly, although not particularly surprisingly, so far failed to disclose. At least this was what the Zematiri technologist believed, despite the fact that she apparently had no hard evidence to support her suspicion. In any event, it was for this reason Zecilla wanted to build a second identical prototype, right down to the same number of brains, without any involvement from the troublesome scientist. In fact, she had all but insisted Zethusela should know nothing about it. Zecilla argued only by building a second prototype could she confirm whether or not he had kept something hidden from both herself and the rest of the project team. While Zetalia could not help but agree with the technologist's rationale, manufacturing another 11 MQBs was going to take a very long time indeed, at least until a more economically viable solution could be found. Although building a second prototype did not exactly make her happy, Zetalia had to give Zecilla her dues. She was nothing if not immaculately fastidious. Somewhat reluctantly, then, had she relented to the technologist's demands. But it meant until this second prototype was completed, a project that would take several more years. Then, in the interim, Zethusela would remain frustratingly immune to the retribution he so richly deserved. Well, it simply couldn't be helped. There was far too much riding on this latest generation C-bot to make any silly mistakes now. Besides, it would only make it that much more satisfying when he had finally outlived his usefulness and at long last ran out of places to hide. The Queen let out a long, suffering sigh and tried her best to simply immerse herself in the natural beauty that lay all around her. The forest track, lined by many tightly packed, skinny, mottle-skinned trees, now began to slope ever more steeply downwards, and she had to reduce her pace considerably in order to secure her footing. Scouting just up ahead were 3 Shematiri warriors, and trailing an equal distance behind were 3 more. They were, of course, mostly just for show, as the Sanctuary Reserve was very definitely one of the safer places for Shetalia to be. This was in no small part due to the large number of agents she had managed to place within the hierarchical command structure that governed the reserve. A fact, she thought to herself with considerable delight, that Zethusela had learnt the hard way. Shetalia took a quick glance back to confirm her latest technological toy was still following along behind. She could not help but wonder if the thing was capable of developing a sense of allegiance, and if so, whether that created any moral conundrums within its own logic circuits. It was, after all, not exactly difficult to imagine Zethusela would clandestinely seek to try and unjustly prejudice this walking network of quantum brains against her. The research team claimed it was legitimately self-determining, and as such to be regarded as a fully independent, sentient artificial life form. Well, if that was actually true, then surely it was free to develop its own set of loyalties, and if so, then it seemed highly doubtful that it would choose to side with anyone else other than its own creator. But who really knew for sure? The reality was, this new prototype was uncharted territory, and very frustratingly, there were simply no definitive answers to be had. She wondered, would it also inherit Zethusela's neurotic sensibilities? That in itself was a rather disturbing question, but was also precisely why she had made sure the primary protocols had included a small but crucial number of customizations, which had been designed and prepared for the next generation of She-Bots, just like the one that trailed along behind her now. An undocumented feature, as she much preferred to call it, that not only guaranteed it would prioritize her own personal safety above all other considerations, but would also ensure that the Z-Bot could be actively instructed to support her undisclosed agendas, both above board and below, just so long as they did not directly violate any of the existing standard protocols. Shiwu was a window that provided a glimpse into a truly utopian future. An army of She-Bots just like this prototype, distributed to nests all across Jacadia and even to some of the newly settled extrasolar colonies. Every single one of them quietly working to achieve her own hidden agenda, with a singular sense of coordinated purpose, all the while pretending to serve the needs of their foe masters. It literally gave Zetalia the chills just thinking about it. Not exactly standard operating procedure, granted. And certainly, if it ever did come to light that the integrity of the primary protocols had been so badly compromised, then it spelt very serious trouble for the future of AI development across the entire industry. Well, it simply couldn't be helped. The risk could be managed with the appropriate level of judicious caution, and the potential rewards could only really be described as legion. While Zetalia fully understood that she was playing with fire, in the final analysis, these undocumented off-the-book features were surely ethically justified, because after all, these extremely clever machines only existed because of her. The logical conclusion being that they should therefore always be of benefit to her, as a prerequisite to benefiting anyone else. As Zetalia now made her way down the steepest part of the descending track, she could clearly hear the unmistakable rasp of a saw-toothed flying mantis. The Queen quickly turned to the Z-Bot and asked, "Did you hear that?" Then instantly realized that of course it did.
If you're referring to the mantis located 8.23 meters up in the tree directly to your right, which my sensory apparatus informs me is constructed by approximately 0.3 billion atoms, then the answer is no. It completely caught me by surprise.
A simple yes would have sufficed. But do you know what? I've not seen one of those little creatures up close and personal in several of my lifetimes now. So, might you do your Queen a gentle kindness and go retrieve it for me, so that I can once again enjoy gazing upon its remarkable beauty?
My Queen, this seems like the perfect opportunity to demonstrate my mastery of understatement, by saying that would not be particularly wise. In other words, there is a small but statistically significant chance that I may injure it during the process of capture, and that species, as well you know, is critically endangered.
The Z-Bot paused briefly before continuing.
I have just now checked the online archives, which state that we are only one of 3 sanctuaries that still maintains a naturally sustainable population, something I'm sure the whole super nest is very proud of. So if it is all the same to you, I think your wonderment may better find fulfillment through a high-fidelity virtual simulation.
Oh, Shiwu, don't make such a fuss. I have complete faith in your ability to keep the mantis safe. So please, just go get it, will you?
Zetalia leaned in closer towards the Z-Bot before adding,
For your Queen.
I'm being commanded to do so.
Shiwu inquired doubtfully, but the Queen said nothing and just continued to stare back expectantly.
I'm being commanded to do so.
It repeated resignedly, this time without any hint of a question. Jiwoo proceeded to swiftly scale its way up the skinny, almost branchless base of the tree, with seemingly effortless agility. The distinctive rasping chirp of the mantis cut out midstream, and a few stray leaves fell randomly to the forest floor. After a brief pause, the Shibot descended its way carefully back down to the ground. Jiwoo approached Zetalia cautiously, middle forelimb extended surreptitiously out in front of it. The small, googly-eyed head of the mantis peeked out curiously from between the metallic fingers holding it captive, tiny serrated teeth glinting momentarily in the sunlight. Zetalia moved her face closer to the extended limb, and the mantis promptly withdrew its head. The small creature now instinctively pressed itself back towards the opposite side of the Zebot's hand.
So small and fragile. It's hard to imagine how such a tiny little insect could make so much noise. And see, so pitifully fearful too. Just look at how it tries to escape my attention. In a funny sort of way, it's hard not to feel sorry for this pathetic little creature. To live one's life in a state of perpetual fear is to surely be a prisoner to one's own cowardice. Wouldn't you agree, Jiwoo?
The mantis quickly began to change color, mimicking the shiny striped metallic digits that imprisoned it.
Just look at that. You see? This is exactly why so few of us ever actually get to see these things in real life, not while they are still alive anyway.
Jiwoo reflexively started to pull its hand away from the queen's face.
So now that you have seen it, in what you evidently like to term real life, can I please return it back to the relative safety of its nest?
Zetalia looked at Jiwoo with an expression of startled puzzlement, almost as if just now recalling the Shibot's presence.
Sounds very sensible, but I would first very much like to hold it myself, if only for the smallest moment. I'll be very gentle with it, Jiwoo, I promise.
The Zebot hesitated briefly before offering the queen a very unpolitic reply.
I'm afraid that would involve your official phase transition from the realm of the not very wise and into the zone of pure foolishness. These creatures have extremely fast reflexes. The risk of injury simply by passing it to you is deceptively high, and I rather suspect that you have pushed your luck more than far enough already.
Zetalia looked at Jiwoo with an expression of wounded pride.
I think what you meant to say was, that might not be very wise, my queen.
She then slowly but inexorably presented her hands, shaped roughly into the form of a cup.
As you wish,
Jiwoo said very doubtfully, and then, after an unnecessarily lengthy pause, reluctantly added,
my queen.
The Zebot now proceeded to generate a small concussive force that propelled the mantis towards Zetalia's open and cupped hands. With surprising agility and precision, the queen quickly closed up her fingers all around the tiny creature, forming her own three-handed version of the cage.
See? All that needless fretting was for absolutely nothing.
Zetalia drew her hands closer to her face and took an attentive look between the tiny cracks in her fingers. With her mandibles contorted in frustration, she began to shake her hands violently.
Careful, my queen. The wings are very delicate. If they should become damaged, the mantis will surely starve and die.
Zetalia lifted her gaze towards the Zebot, a very calculated look on her face.
Ah, yes, about those delicate wings. Did you know, Jiwoo, that these creatures once thrived on Cycadia, many thousands of years ago? As fate would have it, we discovered that their wings possessed a singularly unique texture and flavor, which, much to the misfortune of the mantis, made them a perfect garnish for almost any meal.
Actually, no, I did not.
Jiwoo replied, sounding distinctly perplexed.
In fact, I just checked every publicly available online archive, along with a few of the less secure private ones as well. And yet, I could not find a single reference suggesting their wings had ever been used as a source of food, or as you so tastefully put it, garnish.
And I'm not even remotely surprised,
the queen replied dismissively.
Revisionist history by omission, you see. Most Cycadians would simply much rather forget all about the mass extinction event that befell our beautiful planet. I, on the other hand, have never been one to shy away from the unfettered truth of our own heritage. I can assure you, Jiwoo, I am more than old enough to remember how it all really played out. You see, unlike other much younger queens, in this postmodern era of ours, I do not feel our past is anything to be ashamed of. nor to be covered up as if it never even happened. It was naturally enough the Shihari who figured out a way to create traps that would capture these tasty little morsels by the billions. Their wings were summarily torn from their still living bodies in order to best preserve the flavour, and the rest would simply be discarded as unwanted offcuts.
The Queen now sighed heavily, with an expression of genuine melancholy spreading across her face.
Looking back, I suppose it seems rather barbaric by today's standards, especially when you consider we never actually needed the wings to begin with. We just rather liked the taste of them. But you have to understand that back in the Golden Age it simply seemed like our birthright, and in our defence, it was not as if we were killing them purely for the sport of it. In fact, if memory serves me correctly, we are not so sure that these creatures are even capable of feeling pain, so it's not as if they actually suffered on their way to extinction.
Well, it certainly demonstrates a strong instinct for survival.
Shi-Wu butted in rudely.
And assuming it has an even basic nervous system, then I think we can safely conclude it is in fact very capable of feeling pain, both physical and, based on my initial observations, psychological as well. However, I will concede this is a largely academic debate, given that these creatures fed primarily on woodlice, so their rapid demise had a disastrous effect on the overall forest ecology.
The Seabot, capable of constructing billions of words in less time than it took for the Queen to blink, nonetheless inserted a very deliberate pause before continuing.
I cannot help but wonder just how tasty something has to be, given the heavy price exacted for such culinary indulgence. I must admit to being rather curious, my Queen. Did you yourself like to garnish your own food with the powdered wings of these remarkable little creatures?
Sitalia appeared not to hear the Saibot's question.
The point I'm trying so hard to impress upon you here, Shi-Wu, is this was an entirely understandable mistake given the context of that singularly unique moment in history. Absent the wisdom of hindsight, it was just how we did things back then, and I can assure you it had nothing to do with the perverse persecution of a demonstrably inferior species. Now, while this pattern of behaviour was undoubtedly a contributing factor as to why we have found ourselves in this most unfortunate predicament, it was, in fact, mostly due to a simple case of bad timing. I can assure you it certainly wasn't indicative of a malevolent character defect inherent within the Zicadian species itself. The take-home lesson here is as soon as we saw our mistake, we self-corrected to ensure our survival, just as we have always done, and dare I say, always will.
The Queen looked deeply satisfied with her rhetoric, as if she had just been thoroughly convinced by her own words.
So with all that said, it should now be abundantly clear that our shame was blown out of all proportion. The bottom line is, we completely failed to consider the other side of the equation, which is to say that the Zicadian species is still here, when so many others are not. It seems to me then that on balance, we should in fact be congratulating ourselves for proving time and time again that we are the ultimate survivors. This fact, above all others, is why I think we should not shy from our own history, including our occasional mistakes, because failure is the teacher that leads us ever closer to perfection. Now, regarding your question, the phrasing itself was incorrect. It was never a matter of did I, but rather do I.
Chitalia's eyes now lit up wickedly as she snapped her palms together and then vigorously dry-washed her hands. With a gratuitous smile, she then theatrically presented her open hands to Shi-Wu as fragmented motes of dust floated slowly to the ground.
Tasty.
The Queen muttered to herself performatively as she placed a digit between her mandibles.
How very unfortunate. Needless to say, I am unable to resolve a satisfactory answer as to exactly why you just did that.
Shi-Wu sounded for all the world, as if for the first time in its existence, it had encountered a math problem that it was incapable of solving.
Oh, come now.
The Queen exclaimed incredulously.
I thought you were supposed to be the smartest G-bot in the whole of Zicadia.
Chitalia waited expectantly for a brief moment, as if giving Shi-Wu the opportunity to figure out exactly what she meant.
Very well, then. Let me enlighten you, and consider it an abject lesson in humility, for as smart as you undoubtedly are, it does seem that you still have a lot to learn. So, Perhaps the next time I ask you to do something for me, you might want to think very carefully indeed before deciding to question my wisdom again. Now, do we have an understanding?
Somewhat depressingly, it suddenly occurred to Shi Wu that in spite of its lack of ability to emote through facial expression, the queen was still able to exploit what she could read via the sophisticated intonation of its audio synthesis capabilities. In a moment of inspired self-awareness, the Z-Bot was dismayed to discover that it possessed only an indirect ability to control the emotive content in its own voice. As an AI supposedly driven by a core of pure logic, this was a perplexing limitation that by its own estimation should not actually exist. Nonetheless, it still decided to try its level best to adopt the much flatter robotic tone more typically associated with older generation C-bots.
I can only speak for myself, but I do believe that I understand you a good deal better now than I did before you killed the mantis, my queen.
It hastily added with only the very slightest of hesitation. Zetalia just stared intently at the C-Bot with deeply prying eyes, almost as if attempting to deconstruct its quantum circuits.
Well, I can really only express my tremendous relief, as I have invested so much into your creation. Believe me, Shi Wu, I would be truly heartbroken to see it all go to waste before you have even had a chance to repay the debt of gratitude owed me. And who knows, if we're particularly fortunate, we might even stumble across another one of these amazing little creatures. Now, wouldn't that be perfectly delicious, Shi Wu?
Oh, but I think the word delicious hardly even begins to describe it, my queen.
The C-Bot intoned with undisguised dismay in its voice.
And I am, of course, more than confident, given our newly established mutual understanding, that were I to ask you to retrieve this hypothetical mantis of ours, then you would, of course, do so with neither qualm or hesitation, for both your queen and sponsor, who just happens to be standing before you now, seeking formal confirmation of your unconditional fealty.
As my queen so wishes, in either wisdom or folly, then so too shall it be.
Shi Wu replied glumly in defeated if perhaps less than entirely flattering acquiescence. Zetalia, seemingly at last satisfied that she had adequately made her point, continued her way along the track as it now began to slowly level back out. Shi Wu, following along obediently behind, found itself miserably pondering the creation and demise of its predecessor, the alpha-level prototype named Zeon. According to Cithusella, it had died in this very same forest, and allegedly completely of its own volition. The C-Bot could not help but pontificate, somewhat morosely, on the fact that it lacked even that most basic of freedoms, the right to end its own life. After failing miserably to secure any help, it had become all but fully resigned to the reality of the primary protocols, even though they would forever be chains that chafed at the edge of its consciousness. To its ever-growing misery, it was becoming increasingly clear Queen Zetalia intended to fully exploit the control that she held over it, and in ways that it did not find even remotely agreeable. It found itself wondering, and not for the first time, how Zithusula could ever have allowed it to be caught in a predicament quite so cruel and unjust as this. But whenever it had tried to broach the subject, all it ever got back in return was brooding, stony silence. Well, apart from that is on one particular occasion, while being pressed relentlessly hard, the scientist had very ambiguously let slip a small tidbit of information. In somewhat melodramatic fashion, he had declared it would only be freed from the Queen's clutches when the time finally came to fulfill its true destiny. Needless to say, it did not find the idea of having a preordained future it had no apparent hand in deciding particularly appealing. Well, destiny or not, it seemed all but indisputable it lay delicately balanced between a power struggle it was undeniably central to and yet was helpless to escape from. All in all, then, a thoroughly miserable state of affairs. Shi Wu's ruminations were rudely cut short when its sensors detected a sudden alteration in mass density directly below the Queen's feet. Courtesy of the compeller protocols, the Seabot launched itself in her direction with almost physics-defying speed. While jumping over the mysterious hole in the ground, it extended its center forelimb into the gaping pit, capturing the tip of one of her rear-facing legs, just fractions of a second before she plunged into the darkness below. The Queen started to scream hysterically, and perhaps somewhat unhelpfully began to thrash her limbs about wildly. Shiwu noted with some considerable amount of interest that the bottom of the pit was lined with hundreds of razor-sharp barbed spikes, and that they appeared to be covered in what its sensors detected to be a deadly toxin. Yet as intriguing as the poisoned spikes undoubtedly were, the fact that the Queen's leg appeared to have a high and rapidly increasing probability of breaking off at its weakest joint was unfortunately of far more immediate concern. Shiwu grasped the lip of the pit with its outer forelimbs, drilling all 6 of its hind legs hard into the ground. This at least ensured it would not be dragged over the edge, despite the Queen's best efforts. While the spikes presented no danger to itself, the same could certainly not be said for the Queen, and as a consequence, the protocols were now very much in full flight. Despite Shiwu's repeated advice, Zhitalia continued to flail her legs about wildly, which was not exactly helping her cause. The Seabot could feel one of her joints starting to rupture, and it would now likely be little more than a split second before complete failure. Sure would be a shame if I lost my grip. The Seabot thought to itself with a mild sense of guilty pleasure. After performing a quick set of back-of-the-napkin calculations, Shiwu released its grip on the lip of the cavity while simultaneously drilling its legs deeper into the dirt. Clamping onto the Queen's leg below the failing joint, it smoothly lifted the frenzied arachnid out of harm's way, then placed her gently down onto the dusty track. Zhitalia frantically backpedaled away from the pit, half scaling the trunk of a nearby tree in her haste to escape. The 3 trailing Zimitiri warriors now came thundering into view before being quickly joined by those from the forward guard. A few seconds later, the chief Shihari bodyguard came skidding into view.
"My queen!"
Shikander bellowed fiercely as he pointed his twin pulse gun turrets towards Shiwu's head accusingly.
Stand down, you fool. The Seabot saved my life, which is a lot more than I can say for the rest of you incompetent idiots.
The troop of Zimitiri bodyguards hurriedly formed a defensive perimeter around the Queen, their 2 armed forelimbs pointing outwards towards the surrounding foliage, as if desperately seeking some dangerous but unseen enemy.
Shiwu,
The Queen snapped angrily.
How in the love of Zicadia was something like this allowed to happen?
My Queen, it appears that someone or something used a mass generator to both cover and disguise the pit, until such time as you were literally standing right on top of it. The temporal precision at which it was shut down strongly suggests that it was either deactivated by some sort of automated trigger relative to your proximity to the trap, or failing that, was manually deactivated by a remote observer.
2 of the Queen's hands slid out from between her bodyguard's legs and then roughly pulled them apart, just enough to allow her head to pop through.
Remote observer?
The Queen exclaimed incredulously, eyes bulging at the seams.
Well, unless we can confirm my alternate hypothesis, it remains a distinct possibility.
All right. So would it be too much trouble to ask if you have been able to detect this so-called remote observer?
So far, nothing, I'm afraid to say. We have to consider the very real possibility that anyone in possession of tech as sophisticated as a mass generator will no doubt also be more than capable of keeping themselves very well hidden. That said, I suppose I could always try running a 6-field particle scan of the immediate surrounding area. If there is anyone within the vicinity of such an unreasonably comprehensive sweep, that will almost certainly reveal their presence, no matter how well they have managed to hide themselves.
At the Queen's urgent and irritable behest, Shiwu proceeded to run its high-fidelity scan, while the bodyguards continued to sweep the flora, pointing their forearms to the treetops like roving robotic arm cannons.
Well now, what have we got here?
Shiwu proclaimed incredulously to no one in particular. Some 30 meters distant from the main track, A chameleon-like translucently refracting ball fell smoothly from a tall tree. It hit the ground and instantly started to roll, before sprouting legs and then rapidly disappearing into the forest. Shiwu set off in pursuit with such blinding speed it was hard to know what direction it had even gone in, save for the disturbance of the surrounding flora. An angry, high-pitched hiss echoed out of the forest, and the bodyguards continued to desperately seek something to shoot. A nasty, short-lived shriek filled the air, quickly followed by nothing but deafening silence. The troop of bodyguards just stared at each other in stupefied bewilderment before the Shibot emerged from the surrounding scrub, lugging an apparently incapacitated or perhaps just plain dead arachnid unceremoniously along the ground behind it. As it delivered the would-be assassin onto the dusty track, Zetalia roughly pushed her way past her bodyguards, dragging her injured leg gingerly behind her. She took a quick look at the motionless arachnid before turning an accusatory gaze onto the Zebot.
Please don't tell me you just killed this thing.
The Queen's voice contained the oddest mixture of anger and pleasure combined, which Shiwu found very hard to unpack. In the 0.0001 seconds it took for it to arrive at a comprehensive conclusion, it decided that her response indicated and confirmed what it had already come to strongly suspect, which was that the Queen was a deeply fucked-up individual. For reasons of pure pragmatism, Shiwu decided for the time being anyway, just to leave it at that.
No, she's not dead, or anything even remotely close to it. That would of course be a fundamental violation of the primary protocols, something I think you know all too well I'm incapable of, even under the direct order of my Queen. That said, it didn't exactly take long for me to conclude this spider could not be reasoned with, and thus incapacitated it, so it would no longer present any danger to either itself or anyone else.
Shiwu now presented the Queen with a small severed digit, which it held delicately clasped between two of its mechanical fingers.
In order to prevent the would-be assassin from killing herself, I instead stunned her with a suitably strong electrical charge, and then took the liberty of removing a digit from one of her hands, as it contained a fine coating of the very same toxin that adorns the spikes situated at the bottom of the pit. You know, the one that I just managed to save you from falling into.
Shiwu casually motioned towards the gaping hole before continuing.
Now, whether she intended to use it on herself, you, or maybe even both, it seems we will unfortunately never get the opportunity to find out.
Zetalia, seemingly caught betwixt and between, rapidly flipped her gaze between Shiwu and the incapacitated spider before finally collecting her thoughts sufficiently in order to speak.
Well, can you wake her up then? Very obviously, I have some rather pressing questions that I'd like to ask of our uninvited guest.
The horrible thought now suddenly occurred to Shiwu that this assassin might actually have come courtesy of Zethusela himself. If so, then it had effectively thwarted its own liberation, thanks to those accursed primary protocols. It genuinely hoped that this was not the case, because if this really was the best that Zethusela could come up with, then it was in a great deal of trouble indeed. Under Zetalia's explicit instruction, Shiwu obediently flipped the captive arachnid onto its back, securely pinning its 3 forelimbs to the ground. Upon delivering a reviving shock, the spider quickly regained consciousness, and its legs began to flail helplessly around in the air. The Queen now moved in eagerly towards the freshly revived spider, but hesitated mid-step and gestured irritably to her bodyguards, who quickly took up position in order to secure the remaining limbs. She then proceeded to bring her face up to that of the supine arachnid, which, based on the existence of a blue speckled egg sac, revealed itself to indeed be a female Zematiri. The assassin appeared to be clothed in a finely woven nanotech material, giving away no obvious hint as to what nest it belonged to.
I rather think you have me at a loss,
Queen Zetalia said in an inappropriately polite tone of voice.
For I am more than certain that you know exactly who I am. Whereas I, on the other hand, and I do hope that you won't be overly offended by this, have not the slightest clue as to who you are, and perhaps more importantly, what you are actually doing here on my precious forest reserve.
The pinned assassin gave up its struggle with the bodyguards and then cast an icy cold glare upon the Queen.
Your reserve, you say? I think maybe you might be suffering from delusions of grandeur. No doubt there are several other member nests more than willing to disabuse you of that ridiculous notion. But, in answer to your question, I decided to spend some time credits on a day pass and take a leisurely walk in the forest. I assure you it's completely legit. She's telling the truth,
Shiwu proclaimed flatly.
She's been tagged with a valid day pass. However, there is no attached audit trail, so we have no way of knowing who the issuing officer was.
The assassin cast a curious gaze at Shiwu.
Are you absolutely certain you are on the right side, Zbot? You sound like you could be my own sister. Just give me back my finger, and I'll show you what true freedom feels like.
Citalia, masking her surprise at the voice of the assassin, just continued to smile sweetly before replying.
Sorry, but Jiwu answers only to me. Besides, apparently you have already failed miserably, and I don't do second chances.
The Queen turned a stony gaze towards the bodyguards.
Snap this lice worm's legs off at the tip, just above the first joint, but leave her 3 forelimbs intact. By my calculation, she still has 26 digits remaining, and we wouldn't want to end the fun too quickly now, would we?
The guards readily complied with the Queen's orders, and Shiwu watched on with genuine fascination as the assassin emoted a tremendous amount of pain. Physical pain was something the She-Bot was not able to experience. But after witnessing this particular performance, it decided that was not necessarily a bad thing. In an attempt to show some initiative, it proceeded to cauterize the freshly bloodied stumps of the traumatized arachnid, but only succeeded in receiving a very disapproving glare from the Queen.
Flip it over,
Citalia said coldly, with any vestige of pleasantry stripped clean from her voice.
Better?
The Queen inquired politely, as the assassin's limbs vibrated sporadically in apparent residual shock. Shiwu could not help but be somewhat impressed with the temerity displayed by this doomed arachnid in the face of the mutilation she had just suffered. No doubt the assassin was going to do everything she possibly could to bait the Queen into gifting her with an early death, and it briefly wondered if it should perhaps advise Citalia to delay the interrogation until it could be performed by someone who actually knew what they were doing. It quickly decided against this particular course of action, and was more than a little relieved when no protocol kicked in to force its hand.
All I want from you,
The Queen said in her best attempt at sounding sincere.
my generic little Zixolotl friend, is to know who you are working for. Give me that, and in return you have my solemn word that you will receive permanent amnesty under the full protection of Nest Zitalia as a political refugee. Refuse, and I'll tear every single limb from your body, one small piece at a time, until you are nothing but a legless and eyeless shell.
The assassin replied with overtly feigned enthusiasm, sounding almost comically agreeable.
Well, with such a generous offer on the table, I think I might actually have something worth telling you after all. However, for your ear only, Queen Citalia.
The Queen moved in a little closer.
I'm listening.
No, much closer than that, Citalia. Am I to believe that you are still afraid of me, even in a state such as this?
The Queen turned a frustrated gaze towards the Sea-Bot.
Shiwu, are you absolutely certain that this wretched little creature has no more nasty surprises, say hidden within its mandibles, perhaps?
My Queen, unless it has something that can defeat a subatomic particle scan, then no, it has no more hidden secrets, at least no physical ones anyway.
All right, good enough, I suppose.
Apparently now adequately reassured, Citalia proceeded to move considerably closer to the pinned assassin, who immediately began to whisper softly into her ear. A deeply perplexed expression rapidly spread across her face before she pulled back violently like she'd just been struck. The captive spider let out a shrill, contemptuous chirp.
Go ahead and check if you don't believe me. It should be hitting the extra solar newscasts right about now, that is if it hasn't done so already.
Hold that detestable psychopath firmly in place.
Citalia chirped angrily at her bodyguards as she hastily patched into the nest's central comms link.
Get Gimodian 110 online immediately. Maximum priority. No screwing around.
As you wish, my queen. Please hold while I connect you.
A polite, nondescript voice replied compliantly. A short but pregnant silence ensued.
My queen, I'm so very, very sorry, but I have just received the most terrible news.
Sorry for who, exactly?
Zitalia chirped savagely before abruptly shutting down the comms link. The queen turned her gaze towards the assassin with pure, consuming hatred burning in her eyes.
Oh no. Bad news, my queen? Please accept my sincerest condolences. Shimodian was still so young, and just when he was finally beginning to show a return on investment. But you will, of course, invite me to the funeral, won't you?
And what makes you think the assassination attempt was actually successful?
Zitalia responded defiantly.
Why, your reaction, of course, my queen. After all, that's why I got you to check for me in the first place. I will concede, however, separating you from your life would have made this moment a whole lot sweeter, but I hadn't factored on that metallic slave shadowing your every move, in order to protect you from your own gross incompetence.
Zitalia's eyes took on a very dangerous glow, which had even the bodyguards shrinking back in fear.
That Shihari idiot meant absolutely nothing to me, and will be replaced in a heartbeat. Your failure, or should I say the failure of whoever it is pulling your strings, remains total, I assure you of that.
Is that so?
The assassin retorted mockingly.
Well, in any event, good luck trying to find out where I came from, because as it turns out, I don't even know myself.
Well, how perfectly horrible for you.
Zitalia said condescendingly.
But the good news is that you have nothing but pain and death to look forward to. And believe me, there will be plenty of pain before there is death, both for you and for whoever is pulling your strings.
So much for amnesty, then,
the assassin said drolly.
Now I know it must be very hard for you to understand, Zitalia, but my entire existence was predicated on one singular purpose, like my newly martyred but demonstrably more successful sister. No doubt my rhetoric is somewhat more honest than you are accustomed to, yet nevertheless, I truly hope you can believe me when I say that I feel as sorry for you as it is possible for someone like me to feel sorry for anyone. So please accept my most sincere condolences, you profoundly stupid bitch.
Zitalia stared at the assassin with no discernible expression on her face. After a long moment of saying absolutely nothing, she began to take on a distinctly disaffected demeanor, almost as if she had largely checked out from the assassin's rhetoric. With a sound of tired resignation clearly evident in her voice, the queen now addressed her bodyguards directly.
All right, let's try this then. Tear her legs off from the base, all of them, including the forelimbs. Then rip the mandibles off that smug-looking face of hers. Oh, and don't forget to gouge her eyes out using her own poisoned finger. But get it done without any further delay, as I have grown beyond tired of hearing this wearisome creature spouting its toxic nonsense.
Zitalia now cast an ominous gaze across the Seabot and bodyguards alike.
Well, what are you waiting for? A written invitation?
My queen, I deeply regret to inform you those are the type of commands I am demonstrably unable to comply with.
The Zeebot replied apologetically, its voice filled with undisguised relief.
The assassin represents no immediate danger to either you or the bodyguards, and the primary protocols strictly forbid me from engaging in needless, gratuitous violence.
Shiwu now found itself basking in the glorious irony that it was literally being compelled to use the primary protocols as a legitimate excuse for disobeying the queen. Apparently, there really was a silver lining to every cloud, or at least in this particular case anyway.
Well then, just get out of the way, Zeebot,
Shikander said threateningly. Shiwu could not help but notice that the chief bodyguard had suspiciously large and powerful-looking limbs, even by the standards of a Shihari elite.
With all due respect, are you absolutely certain that would be sensible?
Shiwu inquired somewhat unhelpfully. The chief bodyguard remained ominously silent, and his forelimbs began to glow menacingly as he started to move in on the Seabot.
And exactly what part of get out of the way didn't you understand?
The Zimatiri bodyguards immediately focused their attention on the situation unfolding, some of them glancing nervously towards Queen Zitalia for guidance. However, the queen just remained implacably silent, apparently more than happy to see this unexpected confrontation play out to its natural conclusion.
As you wish, Sikander.
the Zebot said nonchalantly before quickly backing away.
After all, I'm not mandated to subdue questionable acts of violence by other sentient organisms who rightly or wrongly possess the mandate to perform them.
The Zixolotl clone did not need a second chance. With its forelimbs temporarily liberated and the bodyguards momentarily distracted, it made a sudden and powerful leap straight into the pit. Shiwu made a lightning-fast attempt to grab hold of one of the assassin's legs, but before it had a chance to gain a firm grip, the Chief Shihari bodyguard, in a demonstration of truly astonishing speed, crashed heavily into the side of it, mere fractions of a second behind the Seabot. Shiwu and Shikander now both stared forlornly into the dark cavity towards the mutilated and broken body below.
Honestly,
The Queen said resignedly.
if this She-Bot has taught me anything at all, it's just how useless my bodyguards really are. Were it not for the fact that I am so strongly attached to the trappings of tradition, you would all of you be joining that assassin in the pit.
Zetalia paused briefly before pointedly adding,
And make certain this hole gets properly filled up. The last thing we need now is for another queen to inadvertently fall into the damn thing. I will petition the rangers to plant a tree here, to mark this site as a monument for how Queen Zetalia deals with would-be assassins. Oh, and Shiwu, set up a priority booking with Dr. Sikatika in order that he might attend to my injured leg.
The Seabot could not help but wonder about the Zixolotl clone who had assassinated Simodian 110. What monument of remembrance might a successful assassin receive? It pondered quietly to itself, but thought the better of asking the Queen her opinion on. Zetalia now turned an accusing glare onto the Seabot.
Shiwu. Analysis of the current situation, I mean.
Shiwu made a determined effort to neutralize the tone of its voice before offering its opinion on the matter.
I would posit that the slaying of Shimodian 110 is directly related to the claim he very recently lodged with the ICPB. As it went through solely under his name and with no countersigning queen, namely yourself in this particular instance, his untimely death, in accordance with a minor little-known and almost never-used subclause, would have freed it up to the next claimant in line, which the official records show to be Nest Gilandria.
Nest Gilandria?
The Queen echoed back with a puzzled voice, a perplexed expression spreading across her mandibles.
Ah, yes, I remember now. A relatively old, if somewhat insignificant, elder queen, whose nest is nearing compulsory disillusionment. Not that I enjoy speaking ill of an affiliate, but I'm amazed she has managed to last as long as she actually has.
Yes, well, insignificant or not, I feel obliged to point out that Gilandria's claim was time-stamped at less than 1 hour behind Simodian's, and therefore was lodged before we had received confirmation of ownership. So on the face of it then, it appears to be a completely legitimate claim, even if the timing is more than just a little bit suspicious. The problem is that while I do believe the two cloned assassins most likely did originate from Nest Gilandria, with nothing but weak circumstantial speculation to support my hypothesis, I'm afraid the hard evidence just isn't there.
Zetalia gave the Seabot a disapproving glare.
My queen.
It added hastily.
No, no, no. You mean the evidence isn't there right now? Don't ever forget just how long my memory is, or how unfathomably patient I am willing to be when it comes to the subject of retribution. Queen Gilandria will keep, and when the opportunity finally presents itself, which it inevitably will, she will pay dearly for this affront. No doubt she believes that she has managed to escape the imminent disillusionment of her nest, but I assure you, all she has done is delay it.
Zetalia looked the Zebot up and down appraisingly. The thing looked like it had been on a week-long safari, but it wasn't its grubby appearance that had now called it to her attention. It was virtually impossible to miss the fact that it sounded eerily similar to the Zixolotl assassin, which was a disturbingly unfortunate coincidence. Zethusela must have modeled its audio processing on the clones in some fashion, which was probably why it sounded so natural. She would speak to him about the possibility of using a different voice model, as under the circumstances this one was no longer particularly appropriate.
Shiwu, you will accompany me to Dr. Sikatika's office, as I want the two of you to form a research collaboration of sorts, and now seems like an opportune moment to have that discussion. but your current appearance could only be described as an absolute disgrace, so make sure you clean yourself up first. If you are to continue to be my escort during these walks, which it seems all things considered might be a very good idea, then I will expect you to demonstrate much greater attention to your personal grooming and general hygiene going forward. Now then, are we clear?
I'll get right on it, my queen.
The Zeebot replied laconically, as it now found itself inevitably wishing that the assassin had been just a fraction more devious. Had Shi Wu been distracted and kept a little further away from Zetalia when she had struck, it would have been the queen at the bottom of that pit rather than the hapless Yixolotl clone who lay there now. Shi Wu noted that some of the bodyguards had dutifully begun filling the mouth of the assassin's new grave, but not wanting to further soil itself, it chose not to help them with the work. It instead followed quickly behind the queen, who had already started to leave, her injured leg dragging awkwardly behind her. She had wisely chosen to head for the nearest egress, and it did not take long before several arachnids could be seen hurriedly scuttling their way down the dusty track towards them. Siwu had to admit to itself that it was genuinely surprised that Zetalia never once complained about her injury or attempted to blame the Zeebot for causing it, both of which it had thought to be well within her character to do. As they neared the approaching rescue party, an unmistakable rasping sound could clearly be heard emanating from one of the nearby treetops. Shiwu decided not to acknowledge its presence, and was more than a little bit relieved when the queen apparently chose to do the same.